Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the State of Memphis Housing 2021. My name is Joyce Cox, and I am the manager of the Office of Neighborhood Engagement for the City Division of Housing and Community Development. I do have the distinct pleasure of introducing our speakers this afternoon. First, I'll read Mr. Prentiss Dantzler, who joined the University of Toronto as an assistant professor of sociology in 2021. Previously, he held the faculty appointments at Georgia State University under urban studies and Colorado College in sociology. He also served as a Canada US Fulbright scholar at UT and as a scholar in residence at the Institute for Research on Poverty at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He received his PhD in public affairs with a concentration in community development from Rutgers University in Campton. He also holds an MPA uh, from the Westchester University and a BS from Penn State University. His current research explores the relationship between housing subsidies and neighborhood change across the Greater Toronto area. The second is nonprofit and diverging views of gentrification, the relationship between community associations and segregation in the US, and racial capitalism and urban process. We want to welcome Dr. Dantzler. And our next guest is Lauren German. Ms. German began her career specializing in public finance as an attorney advising state and local government in their public finance transactions at the international law firm of Palmer and Dodge, who is now known as Locke Lord LLP. Following that work, Loris joined the public finance department at Fidelity Investments, where she serves as vice president, who launched and led the company's municipal finance efforts in the Northeast and opened Fidelity New York office for public finance investment banking. In addition to her private sector roles, Loris has served as a professor and lecturer in various higher education institutions. She's currently developing the first public finance course for urban planners at the Harvard Graduate School of Design and previously served on the faculty at the Boston College Carroll School of Management. Outside of her current role in higher education, Loris also serves as a senior advisor to the Kresge Foundation. Loris also directs the Public Finance Initiative, a physically sponsored project of Third Sector New England, which works with communities, foundations, and other stakeholders to develop research, education, and technical assistance programs that center the values of equity, sustainability, and inclusive growth in the domain of public finance. And last but not least, I have the pleasure of introducing a young lady who you've heard from a couple of times today, and that is our new Director Ashley Cash. She is the director of the Division of Housing and Community Development for the city of Memphis. Most recently, Ashley has worked to provide support and manage federal funds that address challenges brought on to communities, families, and individuals related to the pandemic. This includes collaborating on solutions around homelessness support, ensuring people remain in their homes, and other related issues. Ashley is a member of the American Planning Association, Urban Land Institute, and a Leadership Memphis alumni. She has twice been the recipient of the Outstanding Planning Award for the Tennessee chapter of the American Planning Association, most recently for the Memphis 3.0 Comprehensive Plan. When she is not working, Ashley enjoys spending time with her husband and her young daughters. Well, Memphis is the place, and this is the time with the acceleration and growth um, around our great city, and that is the city of Memphis. The momentum is taking leaps and bounds. We have to serve the moment and inspire forward movement. Today, we have an opportunity to learn just how we put it all together as we discuss how to make the best out of this moment. Let's give our guest a hand.
And thank you all for having me and us today as we can talk about what we can actually do going forward. And I think the workshops and the panels that we've had today have kind of outlined a lot of different areas in which housing really matters. And it's our job to tie this all together. So I have a few points that I would like to go over just from hearing some of the discussions today and even some thoughts of the work that I've been doing. I'm physically in Atlanta right now, transitioning up to in Toronto in a few weeks. But I've also done work around the country on around housing issues, but a bigger issue of just neighborhood change overall. So housing policy tends to be like one piece of that, and I'll focus on that particular area today. The one thing that the first part I wanted to really kind of discuss today is this call for, like, when we talk about this moment and a lot of federal dollars that's going into local municipalities or even states, what can we expect going forward? And I would be remiss, or I would be a little bit cynical to say, like, I'm not that sure that we'll have this type of level of development going at this scale going forward. This is not something that we shouldn't be pushing for, but as you can see from a lot of the various actors and panelists that we've had today, this is a historic moment where we have a number of federal involvement that we've been calling for years, right? So a lot of ways in which we see this as a moment to say, is this a trend going forward? I'm not sure if it's going to be at the same capacity or the same scale as we can see right now. So we need to be conscious of that. And giving that context, how can the local municipalities actually deal with a lot of the housing issues as they've been seeing across their different spaces, particularly in the city of Memphis as well? And one kind of conversation I was just recently listening to on a panel was this idea of isolation, right? A lot of agencies are working in silos or working individually to address these issues. And that's causing a lot of confusion, or even when things like this, where you have a massive amount of federal dollars going into particular places, a lot of local departments have to collaborate with other people, right? So it would be probably beneficial going forward that we think about collaboration and cross partnerships or cross sector partnerships going forward, not as something that's a response to new money coming into the city, but something that's already established and sustainable going forward, right? So, like, if you have the Division of Housing and Community Development, you have neighborhood engagement, you have the local housing authority, all of these agencies shouldn't be working in isolation. They should have coordination among them so they can be striving to mutual values and goals. The other part, in terms of we've seen some of the issues in terms of getting some of this money out, it's just terms of like protocols implementation and cutting some of the red tape. And this is something that we've seen across, whether it's rental assistance, whether it's giving money to local businesses, whether it was other money from the American Rescue Plan. These are a lot of ways in which we can think about some of the protocols and policies that historically have been embedded in some of these agencies or departments. How can we change that to make these processes a little bit more efficient going forward? We don't, if we have this opportunity to get enough kind of federal money into these places, we don't want that to be held up because we don't have the infrastructure already in place to deal with that large kind of capital investment. The second piece I wanted to talk about is some of the more policy specific things that we've been talking around, at least in the housing space. That I'll kind of cherry pick a few things. One is this big focus on rental assistance that's been alarming with our kind of rising prevalence or rising attention to evictions. So evictions has been, in the academic space, the evictions has been a topic that's been coming up more and more over the last few years or last kind of decade or so. And this has caused a lot of kind of work on evictions specifically, but also a lot of kind of local kind of responses to evictions. And one thing that the city of Memphis and other places have been thinking about have been like, what is the time for a landlord that can file for eviction? Are there any kind of levers or stopgaps in place that help people get back on track for paying their rent? Are there any other subsidies in place that can help people who may not be able to pay their rent right now? But I also want to kind of condition this to think about when we think about this kind of relationship between landlords and tenants, we kind of treat all tenants the same and all landlords the same. And that's just starkly wrong, right? There's a lot of people who own like 1 or 2 units versus the large scale corporate landlords. And when we're actually having these conversations, we need to be very specific and very nuanced and how we're describing the actors in these places, because the same type of policy and programs won't work for the small scale landlords versus the large scale landlords. Those who are not able to pay their rent this month, whether it's a loss of a job or some other issues, we need to kind of treat these people as as the stark variations are different compared to just lumping them in all in one space. And partly we've seen that there's this kind of response between how landlords are actually negotiating rents with local tenants and what can be done about it. The other part on the assistance part is that when we think about this kind of emergency assistance, these emergencies, if they were like 1 month of not being paid rent, this is more of an emergency long term that we're actually kind of really noticing in. So we're already late to the game where we're trying to get money out to somebody who's in the whim of getting evicted versus those who are actually unstable or don't have residential stability long term. And partly what I like to address to this issue is because in this country and in a lot of places, we've promoted home ownership as the number one goal for all households without really thinking about various forms of housing tenure that people take up, right? So for a lot of people, they've been renting in their space for years, if not decades. They have no legal ownership to that place, but they have been renting in those spaces and they're integral people in those communities. And while we're always kind of pushing people into home ownership as a way to build wealth equity, as a way to build just wealth generally, we know that is the number one way that a lot of households, that majority of households in America build wealth. There is a bigger conversation that we need to have about residential stability and what does that look like across various forms of housing tenure, whether you're a short-term or long-term renter or a homeowner or a property owner or even an investor buying up different properties. That causes me to the third kind of conversation. A lot of this focus has been on there's a seminar that I'm doing with some other colleagues in a few weeks, and we've been thinking about, and a lot of conversation has been going around, well, if this is a rental assistance, can we at least think about what a universal housing voucher program actually looks like? And part of this conversation has been thinking about if in this moment we can provide, subsidies to households that are experiencing, unstable residences or residential instability, is there a way that every person who's eligible for a housing voucher can actually do this? Now, we do understand that this will take a large investment from the federal government. We do understand that this will take place. This probably wouldn't be something that would happen in immediate, but something we should be actually striving towards, right? But at the same time, I worry, just in the same kind of historical nature that we treated public housing, where we don't see that much public housing around most of our urban areas in the country, with a few exceptions, that the housing voucher conversation will also go into that lens. Because when we talk about who gets the money, there's always these conversations about who actually deserves the money in the first place, right? Is it those who are just under the income gap? Is it those who are experiencing some type of other hardships in conjunction with that? Even a lot of the housing subsidy money that we typically see, it tends to be seen or going to like senior living facilities or for older adults versus kind of younger, lower income individuals. And that's that's in line of what we've been historically doing when we think about subsidies, that there's always these kind of conversations about who deserves what that gets embedded into how we design these programs, implement the programs, and evaluate these programs. Fourth, I want to talk about a little bit in relation to that is terms of thinking about how can we get local residents' voices raised up in these kind of conversations, right? So as an academic, I'm always constantly going against this idea that I'm always in line with this idea that a lot of the things I study, typically studying lower income communities of color, are something that these people in these communities already know, right? And then for me, it's my idea to bring this more into the academic space or the research space to get other people interested in these ideas, because we've historically seen that these places have been marginalized. And within that marginalization, it's not just that they haven't been seen, they also haven't been heard, right? So a lot of ways in which we're designing policies and programs to attend to certain issues that are going on in these spaces, we also need to understand that we need to ask those people who are actually using these programs, the recipients, how are they faring over the course of these programs? What are these programs and policies not getting right? Because a lot of times, and especially in government work or even nonprofit and policy areas, we tend to evaluate these policies and programs based off of our own ideas about how they should work without really talking to the people that are actually taking advantage of them or actually utilizing them in that place. And lastly, some of these kind of conversations haven't been intentional about talking about the racial equity issue that's undergirding the whole housing issue overall, right? So if we just know that this country was based on racialized and racist housing policies and urban planning practices, then we need to make sure that it's not just something that we acknowledge, but something that we're intentionally fighting on an everyday basis, right? A fight to preserve housing in one neighborhood is not just a fight to keep some people in a home. It's also a racial history or a legacy that we need to keep in that neighborhood. And I think is some of the confusion in this is that we've always kind of thought about housing without and just assumed that that was synonymous with thinking about communities, and that hasn't always been the case, right? If you're just building an affordable housing complex in the middle of a lower income neighborhood without thinking about how that might interact or intersect with other local communities, then that's problematic. If you're thinking about building affordable housing complexes in more wealthier neighborhoods, or what we're starting to hear about as opportunity neighborhoods, without thinking about how communities can actually elaborate and become sustainable, then that's deeply problematic as well. So we'll get to these spaces where we're evaluating the same policies that we set up to fail in the first place. And I think that what that does is kind of align a lot of the issues that we see in terms of the housing space to really get us to take advantage of this moment, how a lot of kind of agencies, nonprofit, and private sectors have been responding to this, but also acknowledge that in this frame, in this ongoing global pandemic, we've lost a lot of people. A lot of people have lost their houses or their businesses. So we're actually starting from some steps backward either way, right? So in this space, we need to really be kind of conscious and intentional about how we're thinking about housing policy going forward. And for me, it's really thinking about community development. It's really thinking about how do we build sustainable communities, because the economic times are going to ebb and flow regardless of the age. There's going to be political shifts regardless of who's in power. There's going to be, private industry in a number of different areas, but there's always going to be people living in these places who are going to live in their families and share in their life regardless of who's around them, right? So in these spaces, we really need to be pushing this idea of how to really build sustainable communities where housing is a central piece, but that cannot be divorced for educational opportunities. That cannot be divorced from, grocery stores and access to food. That cannot be divorced from public transportation or even transportation options. And I think what we've historically been doing is treating even these policy issues in isolation without thinking about how to build holistic, sustainable systems or communities for all people to thrive in place. And with that being said, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Lourdes.
Great. Thank you. I have to say, I agree with absolutely everything that Prentiss has said. And I know Director Cash wanted to offer some comments. Otherwise, I'm happy to jump in and kind of offer a complimentary view to how we think about this incredible moment in time when, as Prentiss said, we have an immense amount of resources at our disposal, and really want to think about the very theme of the summit, which is how do you center equity in your decision making, and specifically really, really leverage and are aware of every single tool in the toolbox that furthers not just the creation of, one housing unit or one complex, but really sort of community development at scale that's sustainable.
Thank you, Lourdes. I appreciate that. And Prentiss, certainly thank you for your comments. If you want to just jump into your discussion, and then we'll have a little bit of Q&A at the end.
Okay, great. In reflecting and preparing for today, I'm going to share a few words from you, and I want you to think as I read this, where did this pledge come from? And specifically, what time frame in America? The Congress hereby declares that the general welfare of the nation's living standards of its people require housing production and the realization as soon as feasible of the goal of a decent home and suitable living environment for every American family. Take a moment as you're in the audience and think, where does that pledge come from and when did it happen? And I'll tell you, these are the words of the 1949 Housing Act. I had not reflected upon that pledge for many years until this week. A faculty colleague at school raised it in a lecture that we were having with students on the theme of affordable housing. And I was surprised when I thought this is over 70 years ago when we, as a nation, really not only pledged, but actually put forward the aspiration that every single American family was deserving of a suitable living environment and decent housing. And think about whether or not we've been able to live up to that aspiration as a nation, particularly when we think about even what's happening now with the American Rescue Plan and the ebbs and flows of how resources have flowed or not towards this high-level goal that we all share together. And I think when I look at that kind of moment in time from over 70 years ago, and I think about today, one of the key things that strike me is how exciting it is to think that of the $1.85 trillion of dollars that we have through the American Rescue Plan, 47 billion of that, roughly about 3%, is specifically earmarked not just for housing, but also utility assistance. And that's just one of many sort of aspects of what's enabled in the significant aid package that is ARP. And one of the most significant pieces that makes this an exciting opportunity, but also incredibly hard, and I want to acknowledge that at the beginning, for communities and all the stakeholders, including the nonprofits, CDFIs, who are all part of the constellation of actors working with cities, counties, and states in the implementation of this effort and others, is knowing how to leverage every single piece that's in there when it's not altogether clear and it's like navigating a maze. Part of the funding comes from, just to make sure that we have a shared understanding, emergency rental assistance, homeowner assistance funds, emergency housing vouchers, homelessness assistance, funds for housing counseling. And you don't just go to one place for that. There are programs that are administered by HUD, there are programs by Treasury, there are programs by NeighborWorks. And then we've got a significant pot of money that comes from the $350 billion that's allocated to states, counties, and also localities that specifically is enabled to be used for affordable housing and qualified census tracts. And this was a really significant piece in my mind when I looked at the evolution of the American Rescue Plan. Many communities saw the first version of this bill, and like all of us said, what does it mean to use this money to respond to the public health emergency or the negative economic impacts of COVID-19 when those terms weren't clearly defined? And luckily, through the many pronouncements from the US Treasury, we now know as of sort of the mid-July timeframe that Treasury will presume that certain types of services and investments, when you make them in a qualified census tract to families who live in these underserved areas, are specifically deemed to be eligible under ARP. And that includes not just eviction protection efforts, but a pretty wide latitude of housing stability and affordable housing efforts in these neighborhoods and in areas that are designated as QCTs. And that's significant because we see that not just there's not funding that's competitive, at a national level, but there's also funding that is directly flowing to communities. And a lot of the challenge of meeting this moment will be doing what I think are four things that, as I said before, are very much aligned with the spirit of what Prentiss offered in his opening remarks. First, it's knowing where to look. And second, making sure that you have a strategy that's cohesive and cross-jurisdictional so that you are not just thinking about the opportunity of the money that you have perhaps flowing to your jurisdiction in a way that doesn't require competition or application for those dollars, but actually saying, how are we developing a comprehensive strategy for every single pocket of that money? And how are you doing that in partnership with other governments? When you think about the scale of these challenges, both going beyond the neighborhood and really thinking regionally about the kind of outcomes that you want for your community situated within a larger jurisdictional frame. I think the second piece, when you navigate the complexity of ARP, and it might seem difficult to say, well, how do we do this if just wrapping our arms around this one piece of legislation is not insignificant and is really challenging, is saying, are you already developing parallel strategies from the beginning of this process to actually think about what's going to happen in 2024, because these are time-limited funds, or perhaps 2026 if you are part of the statute that allows you to spend after you've obligated funds through that date, to continue these efforts that you seed. And I think that that's where I'm seeing a small subset of communities rise to the top and really think about comprehensive public finance strategies that are going to enable sustained community investment. And they're doing it in ways that leverage more so than just federal funds, but actually saying, who do we bring to the table right now as co-investors from the private sector, and also thinking about public finance levers that you might not be pulling because you are already flush with resources to make sure that you have that continued channel of investment. And part of why that's important is because they're an entire suite of what I would call underutilized resources, for example, like impact fees, thinking about whether or not you have inclusionary zoning mechanisms in place, thinking about whether or not you are fully working with your state housing finance authority and looking at their ability to do the kind of loan and tax exempt borrowing that might bring the developer community in a way to create and expand the stock of mixed use housing and the full range of, as Prentiss described, 10-year opportunities that people experiencing in a community beyond home ownership, but also for the rental market in ways that are advantageous, cost efficient, and also include another partner, particularly your state housing finance authorities, in ways that could really be advantageous to the scale of resources that they can raise. And even though it's hard to think about that in this moment, you don't want to miss the window to actually say, is our strategy not just poised to succeed today with what we can seed from fund from ARP, but also is it going to be poised to succeed into the future? And I think beyond that, just as Prentiss acknowledged that there's a variety of, tenure opportunities and realities that are manifest in the United States at the homeowner and renter level, there are a number of opportunities that communities are also using to respond to the scale and scope of how they want affordable housing to be present in their community and the permanence of that. And that includes stretching to think about community land trust, thinking about those vehicles, including, affordable housing trust funds. Whether or not you have them, can you accelerate the investment in them, even by leveraging ARP dollars, and think about current uses that are going to be in the timeline of the statute? Because there are benefits that we could certainly get into deeply in this conversation that can exist within those vehicles, including a greater permanence of affordable housing, greater latitude than what a city might be able to do on its own, that come from just thinking a little bit strategically and creatively about that form of investment and what it can mean for your community. And I think one of the additional points I'll include, sort of for your consideration is, beyond asking you to think strategically about the maze that is ARP and how difficult it is to navigate. And then in addition to that, thinking about all these other strategies you want to run in parallel to make sure the things you begin, those programs from a housing standpoint that are seeded, have continuity and sustainability, is there equity in your plan of finance? Beyond thinking about the really important questions of equity in the distribution, equity in the allocation, and the kind of place-based outcomes that you are achieving just by the way that you are situating and choosing to make decisions about which geographic areas, blocks, and corridors will be the beneficiaries of, the housing that you're going to build, and sort of all the other, parallel social programs and aspects of neighborhood change that you are hopefully beginning with these funds. Think about whether or not, when you bring in other capital to the table and other revenues and other sources and other partners, the entire plan of finance also reflects that deep commitment to equity, because that is important and not something to be missed. Part of what many of us are seeing at a national level is obviously the continued heightened attention over fines and fees reform, making sure that as a community, you're not just building up your balance sheet, when you are facing fiscally challenging times, on the backs of the underserved and communities of color who historically have been marginalized. It's important to think about that, not just in the context of fines and fees, but in every single investment and revenue instrument that you pull as a community, every single public-private partnership, and every way that you devise sort of the entire, framework of the capital that's going to flow into all of these investments to continue and bring them beyond just the ARP moment in time. And beyond thinking also about sort of that aspect of equity, think also about how that could manifest in what are deferred maintenance needs. When you have a housing stock that is aging, beyond expanding it by creating things that are new, think about whether or not you are paying attention to the existing housing stock of a community. Because if we took a look under the hood, we don't even need to look beyond the American Society of Civil Engineers and sort of the grade that they give to America's aging infrastructure. Think about whether or not you are measuring and actively looking for disparities in your existing housing stock around which there is sort of a public character. And you have a responsibility to those residents to think about the preservation and maintenance while you are thinking about where there are needs to build and construct and expand new housing stock. And I think if you are able to sort of encapsulate and incorporate in your strategy a component of those things sort of with a national eye, it rises to the level of, what I would consider a comprehensive strategy that is ambitious, but that certainly really speaks to a commitment to housing and really leveraging every resource that we have in service of, the pledge statement that I read when I began my comment. Think about what we have promised to ourselves as a nation when leaders in Congress really said in 1949 that every single American family deserves a healthy and suitable place to live, and how as a community we are sort of living up to that promise and making choices at every end of the spectrum that really live up to those words and make them a reality. And with that, I'll pause so that we can continue the conversation, and happy to dive into some and expand on any of these topics.
Great. Thank you so much, Lourdes. And let me just say, before we jump into the conversation, I am honored to be sharing a stage with two brilliant minds of yourselves. And so thank you so much for joining us and making time today. A lot of really great information was shared. I know that both of you all have huge concepts and a lot of detail and background, and are trying to distill it down in a couple of minutes and help people get the key points. And so I appreciate that. There are a couple of things that I keyed in on, and I want to, you actually took a question, Prentiss, out of my mouth. So, and you answered it a little bit, Lourdes, but I just wanted to stay here for a minute and think about, as we're in the middle of receiving millions of dollars in federal funding for, like you said, the rescue plan, for emergency rental assistance, other kind of assistance. And so just thinking about having that money, we know it's our task to not only get it spent, but get it spent quickly to help people. And we truly want to meet that need. How do we balance thinking about the end? So the end will come. And a lot of these issues that we know are persistent. So I need help paying my rent today, but I actually needed help paying my rent before COVID. But now there's an outlet to do that. And so really, if y'all just, and maybe Prentiss, we can start with you, and Lourdes, if you want to offer any additional comments, but just talk a little bit, if you can, about what your thoughts and recommendations from what you've seen in research might be around as we come to the close of some of these programs and people are still in need, but the funding sort of dries up. What can we do as a city, or what can we be thinking about to mitigate a little bit of that?
Sure. I think that's a great question. I think I would say that part of it is that what I like to call the politics of intervention. So a lot of these kind of conversations get crafted, especially the affordable housing conversation gets crafted as we need to build more affordable housing. But we also need to acknowledge that seeing that housing actually in use would be a couple years from now, right? Usually a couple years from now, between financing, between getting it built, between actually getting residents in place. So then that leaves us to say these are going to be residents who may be in other parts of that community going to be living in that space. But what can we do about the people that are actually living in these communities right now? And I think that gives you or brings you to a different set of policies and programs that can address their ongoing state of residential instability versus thinking about affordable housing as like the kind of silver bullet. And doing that, as we see, right, like thinking about how can we expand the kind of housing voucher program. And in doing that, how can you get more landlords to participate in that particular program? Are there other ways to secure housing long term, as Laura said, about like community land trusts? Is there a way to expand the geography in which nonprofits or other agencies can establish their own land trust, their community land trust for the long term? And just thinking about like this, the housing piece is one thing, but what is it to be said about having housing, but you don't have access to, suitable jobs? Or what is there to be said about having housing, but there's going to be a big transportation gap, even if you build this new space in one place and people still have to get to another part of the city, right? So thinking about sustainable living strategies. And I think that's what a lot of residents and the work I do always have, like, these are the big plans that the city might do. And a lot of residents, well, I don't really need that, or that doesn't help me today. Here's what I need, right? And it's usually like access to a good job or some types of subsidies going forward that address like rental assistance, but even being a homeowner, right? And not having those kind of access. And even to Lourdes' point about having an aging housing stock, some of the work that I've been working with a couple groups in Atlanta, just thinking about some of the issues that some of our long-term lower income housing homeowners have is with maintenance. So are there other programs that we can put in place or establish where there could be zero interest or low interest loans through the local government for older or longer homeowners in this space, so they can deal with some of the maintenance issues in their particular places? And I think that's part of the issue where this conversation has always usually been framed around homeowners and renters. And there's so many people that are in transition from one of those stages or even not in those stages at all, right? And we can think about people experiencing homelessness and what does that side of the sector or the spectrum really look at. And there's a number of ways where we have a lot of tools. I just think we have to be very strategic and think about which tools fit the right kind of issue that we're really trying to tackle. But to do that, we have to have honest conversations about what are the real issues that we see in our like academic spaces, even in local government and nonprofits, but also community members in and of themselves, because they will honestly tell you what's going on versus us speculating or having our own ideas about what we should do going forward.
Yeah, and I will say I agree with that 100%. And I will add that one of the amazing things of this moment in time is think about cities that never had an emergency rental assistance fund, but because of ARP, they were able to create one for the first time because there was a specific legislative directive. When 2024 comes and goes, obviously, if there are no additional funds there from ARP, that doesn't mean you can't make an appropriation or allocation as a city to have continuity to that. Now, the challenge would be, where are you going to get that money? Because the predominant place that would have to come from would be in a traditional municipality city budget, the general fund. and the core account from which you fund, all the operations and current infrastructure needs, on a pay-as-you-go basis, and other basically like the cost of running the government. And if you never plan for that, and for example, you either have a budget that's in an unhealthy state or facing a structural imbalance, that could feel like an impossible charge. This is the moment in time to begin saying, in 2023, before 2024, 2022, do we bring to the table a philanthropic partner who perhaps has never thought about providing additional companion capital to the way that we've started this fund? Or think about social investment vehicles that you could use to perhaps seed that fund when you think about the target outcomes you might want from a pay for success standpoint, when you think about the allocation of those dollars and the use of those proceeds. And it's just kind of, I think, the strategic thinking that even though you are enabled as a government to raise money, if for some reason you cannot give continuity from your general fund by making allocations to this great program, there's no reason to not think creatively about who else can come to the table and perhaps provide funding, whether it's also the private sector, and think about also whether you are fully leveraging your real estate development community. Obviously, the strength of real estate markets has changed significantly during COVID, and it's going to be very different, and it could carry a whole host of disparities that would be reflective in that activity if we were to look at different real estate markets across America, not just now, but even across the last 10 years. But one of the things I would do as a jurisdiction is say, are we using in lieu fees? Are we using linkage fees? Are we using every single tool in the tool chest from our developers where we have a strong development community in some pocket of this jurisdiction that we are leaving money on the table? And if we perhaps pulled that public finance lever and said, we are going to earmark that money for the continuation of our emergency rental assistance fund, you could not only boost the fiscal base, because here you have continuity of revenues that otherwise weren't being leveraged before, which is always a good thing, particularly when you're approaching it with an equity-informed lens. And you're saying it's not going to be on the backs of a fine and fee to people in our community, but actually towards an institutional actor that can support it, and that otherwise, would fund something that is otherwise going to sunset when ARP is gone.
If I could add just another quick point, because something was made me think about something else, is this piece about this being a housing issue without thinking about being strategic and how we change the political discourse around some of these issues, right? So one of the kind of things we saw in popular media was this idea that people are being stuck in place, and communities that were highly segregated, had lower income, particularly communities of color, had bigger instances of having COVID spread or something like that, right? But then the kind of conversation shifted to think about not as a housing situation, but a public health issue. And I think that's what we need to do when we're thinking about partnering with kind of philanthropies or foundations. How can we change the political discourse around what these issues really are to attract some of that money into this space, right? It doesn't need to just be a housing issue. It could be a public health issue, or even a climate change or environmental issue, where some kind of foundations may be more geared to deal with issues in that space versus just treating a housing issue going forward. So I think we have to be strategic in how we kind of discuss and frame these issues versus just going on to the same space like, hey, we need money for housing, when it's so much more than just having a physical development.
Great. Thank you. And that makes so much sense. And really, it's a comprehensive approach. And so, yes, we do need the housing piece, but who are our healthcare partners who are helping to make sure that the homes are safe, and we all have a role to play in this. So I appreciate that. I was just thinking, kind of reflecting back and on your comments as well, Lourdes, about making the case. And it's so simple, but being in the box, you just don't see outside of it sometimes. And so really thinking about making the case. We've spent since March over $22 million in rent and utility assistance for the city and county, which is huge. And people are still, knocking on the door. Obviously, we've got a lot of money to meet that need, but just saying when that money does run out, we can go to those other partners. It may be bank partners. Part of it could be our city government, and just put a stack together to meet that need. So I think that's a great solution that's simple and innovative as well. So I think, Prentiss, you said something that jogged my memory a little bit, but we are talking about making the most of the moment. So being frank, the moment sucks, right? We are in a pandemic. We've had all kinds of challenges. We've been stuck at home. We've been forced to go to work. All these different things line up, whatever your personal challenges is, including sickness, death, families being separated, very, very serious issues. research has shown us, and I'm preaching to the choir here, but research has shown us that communities of color, and particularly low-income people, are always the groups who are most negatively affected by any type of catastrophe. And so really, we've been talking a lot about equity. We've been talking about change. We think some of that is geographic. We think a lot of that is being intentional. But just if you all could offer some thoughts, and I might flip it and start with you, Lourdes, if that's okay. But if you can offer some thoughts around how do we really start to break down or shift that paradigm, and break down those systemic barriers that are keeping our communities from thriving.
Gosh, that is the $1 million question, isn't it? I'm going to try my best, and I know that we probably would need an entire summit on just that question. But three things come to mind. First, and I think Prentiss hearkened to a lot of this, is really asking ourselves: do we understand like the full taxonomy and continuum of equity interventions that a place needs in order to see an improvement in those social determinants of equity? And this example kind of came up when I started talking about, the difference of sort of housing tenure, rental versus home ownership, and where we go towards a policy solution. But have we really asked ourselves, where will that policy solution lead when we think about the determinants of a place? And I think that there's not enough thinking that I'm seeing around that, of actually saying, let's kind of maybe map that out and really understand, historically, even just thinking about different conditions that exist in different contexts, what is that when you think about it comprehensively? And when you think about the root causes of inequity in both the historical frame as they manifest in different places and regions. Second is thinking about regional scale solutions, because often we think about, city-centric solutions that are very important. And obviously that's where you would have the greatest, level of autonomy and need to be at the very top of the list. But thinking, are we doing enough work that is cross-jurisdictional and really bringing every partner to the table in earnest? Because that's where we're going to see outcomes, particularly where we have some borderless issues, like, for example, issues of environmental justice that particularly in flood-prone regions are really impacting communities of color disproportionately above others. And in addition to that, I think the third piece that I would emphasize is making sure that there are genuine channels of community engagement. Obviously, we cannot just create policy solutions in a vacuum, but you really have to think about how you are bringing folks to the table and who you're bringing to the table through those channels. Are you having an engagement process that just, meets the requirements of open meeting law and bringing people to the table who otherwise would always show up? Or are they really important constituencies, particularly communities of color, who are not participating through those processes and whose voices you are not hearing, in order to really understand the nuances of what's needed and also how they are perceiving interventions in a place? So those would be the three things that I would offer. And then a distant fourth that's also important is, when you are going to fund change, hearkening back to something I said earlier, make sure that you're not just thinking about equity in the distribution of resources, but like, is there equity in your plan of finance and how you're raising money, both on your own as a jurisdiction, and even when you bring in that money through other partnerships that require loan, equity, debt, and capital, or even public-private partnerships around which design, building, operating, and maintaining a facility is going to be a joint venture that's not centralized in government.
Great, thank you. Prentiss?
Yeah, this is a hard question, but I think, it always comes up at the same way too, right? So I think a lot of times in which we're thinking about solutions, it gets boggled down to like, how can we be more equitable without just doing the reverse of some of the things that we've actually already done, right? So I think part of this point, I want to just kind of jump on that again, is just like, what does authentic community engagement actually look like? And what type of ways in which are we building political capacity or organizing people in local communities to have a voice or to even interact with government on an ongoing basis, and not just when it's in a political time where there's an election coming up. And I think that's the piece where you're working backwards in a lot of points in time where it's like you only see politicians talk about particular issues when there's election coming up, and there's a disengagement on the long front, right? So they still feel divorced from the government when they're not needed, but also feel, overly surveillanced or overly interacted with during times of election when they need their vote. And I think, how can we think about building political capacity at the local level, whether it's through community associations, whether it's through even tenant associations for people that are actually on vouchers, right? What does that look like to build capacity around the city? If you had a meeting space for people that are on kind of housing assistance to get together and talk about the issues that they're facing with their landlords, right? I think we have to design and frame institutional arrangements by which local communities can actually build political and power on their own terms. The other piece in terms of Lori's point is just like thinking about the different ways in which we're funding some of these initiatives. And I think that's a bigger piece where I've seen a lot of places where I see lower, seemingly lower scale or low scale landlords flip a lot of properties for their communities because they actually are from the community versus, but a lot of the money is geared toward large scale developers, right? So are there programs and policies that we can implement or build to create funding or financial opportunities for some long-term community members who we know are just going to be in the community, embedded in the community long-term going forward? And then lastly, I think we have to have like a realistic conversation about what does collaboration across different sectors actually look like. And this goes in line with a lot of the kind of conversations that we've been having today. But one of the questions that always comes up is like, how do you get the private sector to work with us? How do you get that, right? And I'm a little bit more cynical in thinking about like the private sector is going to work with it if you make it advantageous for them, but that shouldn't be your automatic go-to when you're thinking about this just because you're not getting the federal dollars in place. So in doing that, you should be building cross-sector collaborations and partnerships so you can actually, one, advocate for money at the federal and state level, but two, build a capacity at the local level where you can be more sustainable or resilient to some of these economic downturns and upscales as they take place across different spaces. And I think that's more of a sustainable long-term strategy where, you know, a huge injectment of federal dollars may not come for another 5 years. And let's say the Senate changes and Congress changes and the presidency changes, what are going to be the financial incentives or agenda for them going forward is going to have a starkly effect on even our local municipalities. So that means that we have to like build stronger collaborations and partnerships going forward so that the kind of federal oversight doesn't have as big of a sense of like, hey, we got money now. It's like, we're used to not getting money. So this is what we did in response for being historically marginalized, but still advocate for those type of resources and investments that we historically have been needing.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate you sharing that. And I was just thinking with our American Rescue Plan dollars, so we're trying to be creative and serve existing needs. We've got about $5 million that's earmarked for home repair. But with that being said, trying to think about that preservation and stabilization piece. With that being said, Lourdes, I'd love if you can just talk a little bit about, you mentioned a comprehensive finance strategy. And so maybe either what some other places are doing or what we could consider in that vein.
Sure. And again, you know, one of the things that we want to keep in mind is that interventions are going to be context specific, right? So for one of the first things that I would say is every place should at least be performing into some periodic basis an audit of their affordable housing stock and saying, you know, do we really have our arms wrapped around the deferred maintenance challenges, particularly with our, you know, the not just, you know, infrastructure generally within the community, but also affordable housing, and also looking at the deferred maintenance needs, even like of the social infrastructure, like, you know, like schools and other key structures of government in lower to middle income neighborhoods, and particularly those that have, you know, underserved communities. And once you have a sense of that, part of what I would say is you want to do a needs assessment matched with your public finance capacity, thinking what on a current year's basis are we able to fund just from the, you know, traditional government funding via pay-as-you-go, both anticipating that there might be an infrastructure bill and also planning for the use of American Rescue Plan dollars where it's, you know, available for like water, sewage, broadband, or affordable housing in the qualified census tracts. And then thinking more broadly, are you leveraging strategically and in a way that reflects intergenerational equity, the predominant source of financing in the United States, which is municipal bonds? Traditionally, most infrastructure in America that is brick and mortar has some composition and intersection with a municipal bond at some stage, whether it's at the new construction stage or in the operations and maintenance phase of, you know, buildings that meet the end or the middle of their useful life. And one of the key things as a community that you want to do is think, do you have a comprehensive plan for borrowing in order to meet and ensure the safety and continued success of your housing stock, but also in tandem with the social infrastructure of the community? And in order to also assess whether or not you are being overly reliant on borrowing, or perhaps, you know, your balance sheet could use some relief, one of the things I would also encourage is an audit of whether or not you're fully leveraging a suite of financial tools that often fall under the heading of land value return, land value capture. This is significant because often many communities don't know that they can use, you know, some of the resources that I mentioned before, for example, like impact fees, and they often think of value capture under the heading of tax increment finance, you know, something where you segment and segregate a portion of your, you know, property tax to a defined geographic area, you know, tied to an economic development strategy, which is an oversimplification. But often what I see with communities is that they have a lot of under-leveraged resources, you know, to raise money and particularly divert it towards infrastructure that might lessen their ability to borrow money, ease the ability when they're thinking about paying for things as they go. And these are all complementary strategies, when the ARP funds either go away, or to do them in parallel, or to do them either in parallel or in sort of when, let's say, an infrastructure bill, if it ever materializes, might sunset. And in that regard, you're sort of leveraging at least sort of every tool that is possibly enabled in your municipality to its fullest extent, and also not over prioritizing a reliance on fines and fees, for example, that otherwise might have an impact on communities that are underserved, low income, or communities of color.
And Prentiss, I wanted to give you the opportunity to weigh in on that, just thinking about how can we be more comprehensive as it relates to city financing or working with other partners.
Yeah, I think Laura's touched upon a lot of it, but the piece that she kind of led off is the most important, that so many of the financial or the financing has to be so context specific in terms of how we're talking about this, right? And I think a lot of times when we're thinking about ways to do it, we have these aspirations to work with actors that we historically don't work with, but they may not be as willing to work with the city of Memphis or see a advantage or have any experience working with the city of Memphis, because they usually go to their same type of fundees, right? So a lot of the funding kind of histories begin to repeat themselves over and over again, where people are getting money from the same places over the long term. So if you're thinking strategically about where this money is being used, then one is double down on the relationship that you already have with some funding agencies, or even the relationships with philanthropy and foundations. But two, think about more strategic ways to explore new possibilities without harming the relationships that you already have in place at the local level. So that deals with a lot of the kind of relationship between kind of foundations, philanthropies going into the city, but also where's the city getting the most of the kind of financing from? Is it the state? Is it local? Is it foundations? And having those kind of relationships to try to build some of those streamlines going forward.
Great. Thank you. I've got one closing question. And it's kind of brought on by the reading of the pledge related to the Housing Act. So wicked problems. We always get these solutions to these issues, and they always produce more issues. And so just thinking about the American Rescue Plan, a lot of money going to a lot of different cities. There's a lot of flexibility in how to use those. I think Treasury has loosened a lot of regulations where hopefully people can get funds more easily or receive funds more easily. But in y'all's review of those programs, or even if you want to talk about other federal programs, that's great too. But what are some of the things that cities should keep a watch for? What have you felt like, or you've seen that maybe an undercurrent to say, be careful about paying, X number of entities this, or doing this sort of thing? Have you noticed anything related to what some potential issues for the ARPA funds might be?
I'll quickly, I haven't seen anything more recently. I think part of it is, it's not specific, but it's more broader. And I think part of that is to not rely on this kind of capital investment for the long term. I think if any kind of agency or local department is thinking about, oh, this may be the new trend going forward, that's probably not realistic, right? So like thinking about if you're preparing for this, like this one-time, quote unquote, one-time capital investment into, or funding investments into different resources or policies or programs, then you need to also be mindful about, say, all right, so if this money doesn't come after the next couple of years, then what do we do, right? And be having an honest conversation about how you're going to rearrange your budget to address this money not being in that place. The other piece, I think, in terms of at least the housing eviction assistance space, is to think about that, what does this kind of overall system look like going forward? And I think part of it is that when you think about kind of this, the emergency housing assistance, there's always going to be a crisis of, housing and unequal housing across different spaces or across different neighborhoods. So if you're really thinking about how to build, sustainable housing strategies going forward, then you need to start to think about what are some of the programs or the policies or tools that we already have, like community land trust, that we're not exploring a little bit more deeply, right? And does this moment allow us the opportunity to explore those programs in tandem of allocating some of this other resource of money as we're kind of crafting a new way to kind of think about housing going forward, right? And then lastly, I think this kind of very big intersection between housing and health has become like to the front or foremost of a lot of people's minds. But historically, I would say that most people weren't thinking about it in that particular way, right? So I think a lot of people, where they were thinking about health outcomes, they were thinking more about individual behavior, but we see the deep connection between housing and health outcomes. So when we're thinking about building healthy communities, what does that look like? And having like a bigger, better conversation across different sectors, whether it's people that are working in housing, but also working in the health sector, but also working in community service and other social services. We need to have more kind of cross-sector partnerships and not function in isolation. And while this moment has allowed a lot of different departments and agencies and actors to collaborate with one another, I would hope that these kind of patterns of partnership continue into the future and don't just end when these kind of the money just runs out. That's a big fear of mine, is that these kind of holistic or collaborative kind of strategic advantages that a lot of institutions and agencies have been doing doesn't just fall short in the short term and leave us at the same place where a lot of agencies and departments were working in isolation. So we need to kind of build that as like essential to the infrastructure of the way the system works, and not just a response to when we have another emergency.
And I think the way that I would respond to that question is sort of by elevating three themes. So the first would be one of the great things about the American Rescue Plan that's also a challenge is, at least at the community level and through certain other programs, or city level, I'll correct myself, is it encourages the sort of measurement and reporting around not just kind of the financial use of the funds, but also, for example, equity outcomes in a community, which is wonderful. But we all know that, many CFOs and treasurers who are charged with managing this money are not social scientists. And this is really hard. And often even impact measurement in, universities and foundations is an extremely difficult task. So when you are thinking as a community, sort of what outcomes you are hoping to achieve with ARP, I would encourage folks to take a step back and also acknowledge that the kind of place-based outcomes you're achieving are not just going to be related to one infusion of dollars from the American Rescue Plan, but really should be thought about in tandem with every other funding source and strategic decision that's happening in the same window of time that the funds are being used. And one of the things you really want to measure and watch out for are unintended outcomes. And I'll give one example. There is a program called Property Assessed Clean Energy, which is completely premised around environmental justice, making sure that homeowners had access to low interest loans where they wanted to make, energy improvements, and others to their properties that would be aligned with, the wider goals we have around climate change as a society and others. And nobody thought that program, with sort of its incredible promise and commitment to environmental justice, would ever lead to displacement. But that's what's happened in California, particularly for communities of color and other jurisdictions, where only years after starting this program did the data show that many communities who couldn't pay the special assessment, tied to this particular program over time and didn't understand the financial terms of it, actually ended up losing their homes. And there was research that shows that disproportionately this impacted Black and Brown communities. And I offer that to say that in this moment in time where we have a commitment at the federal level that is encouraging measurement and actually the reporting and transparency around outcomes of what happens with the investments we are making, think about the opportunity to do that more broadly across the whole of government, so that you really are saying, where are our strategies going that we've had in place in tandem and in parallel with this immense moment in time of opportunity. It might be surprising that really might teach you as a community how to think about which efforts are most strategic and how to think about the future going forward, even after ARP sunsets, and you want to continue to think about place-based outcomes you want to achieve. And that ties to the second theme of really planning for neighborhood stabilization and change. Even when if let's say you're one of the communities who starts making disproportionate, housing investments in a qualified census tract because ARP now enables that, make sure that you think about what's going to happen in that community, because you are concentrating investments in a different way than you were before in this particular, qualified census tract of your place. And separately from that, obviously, every place is going to be different. So the way that these investments manifest in the choices will have to be reflective of the broader fiscal health of the community, because we all know that governments have to keep running and they cannot disappear. And we know that solvency is important. So I think thinking about these strategies, both from an equity-centered lens, as we've discussed today, but also in view of the community's financial foundation, is going to be important. Those goals are not trade-offs. They can exist together, and they should.
Great. I appreciate both of y'all's insight. I believe that's our time for today. That's a great way to close and end. And I've enjoyed taking a moment, taking a step back of the from meetings and reporting and doing the day-to-day work, having your head down to really think about these issues, to hear from experts like yourselves and hear from practitioners throughout the day. And so we appreciate you all. We hope one day to see you all in person. And with that, I think we'll go ahead and close out this session. Thank you, Prentiss. Thank you, Lourdes. Y'all have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.